Chefs of Reddit, what's your number one useful cooking tip? You can clean while you cook. Sharp knives make everything easier. If you have to keep adding salt, try adding some citric acid instead. Not a food tip but a cooking tip. A falling knife has no handle. If you drop a knife, get the hell out of the way and let it hit the floor. Washing it is easy enough. Try to catch it and you could be visiting the emergency room. Pastry chef here. Not my best tip but the only one I can think of this early on my day off. Flouring pans for cakes is a step not to be skipped, but when it comes to chocolate cakes, it looks awful, so for dark cakes, I use cocoa powder instead. Learn cooking techniques instead of recipes. Don't approach recipes like they're magic spells in the Harry Potter universe. If you wiggle your nose wrong or put in a speck too much of some seasoning, you're not going to end up with a completely different dish. Alton Brown does an incredible job of teaching a cooking technique and then showing you a recipe that applies that technique. If you learn a process instead of a rote recipe, you will know how to cook dozens of dishes. And it's really the only way to develop skills in the kitchen. Roasted garlic. Garlic is cheap and you don't even need a ceramic garlic roaster. Although having one in the kitchen looks good. Just slice off the top of the bulbs and cover with a little olive oil, salt and pepper. Wrap in tin foil and place in the oven at 350 Fahrenheit for 50-60 minutes. You can add it to sauces, spread on bread etc. etc. Neat feature of roasted garlic is that over time its chemical composition breaks down into more and more sugar. So any sauce you make with it will become sweeter. I make tomato sauce with it and it's delicious to begin with. But just a few days later it tastes twice as good. Edit. Can't believe I forgot the absolute best use for roasted garlic, mashed potatoes. Don't cook with oil while naked. Control your heat. Control everything, but mostly your heat. Chop with the rear part of the blade, not the tip, in a rolling motion. Mise en place, which is French for cut and measure your it out ahead of time. Saves so much stress. The only recipe that should have only 1 clove of garlic in it is a recipe for 1 clove of garlic. 2 minimum people. Keep it simple. Something with 3-4 ingredients that go really well together is better than something with 12 ingredients that clash with each other. Not a chef, but cooking is my hobby. Number 1 rule in my book is follow a recipe exactly at least once before ducking around with it. I've seen too many people get angry or frustrated because they decided to substitute X for Y, and then the dish turns out badly. Try the recipe first, then decide if there's too much garlic, or if cinnamon would taste better to you than nutmeg. If you hate peeling garlic, take as many cloves as you need, toss them in a bowl, cover with another bowl, and shake the hell out of it. The peels get knocked off. Also, duck margarine. Just use butter. You can use the stem of broccoli. Just peel, slice and fry it in the pan. It's delicious. Timers. I always forget I have something going on the stove while I'm cutting something across the kitchen. Timers save lives. If you're worried about calories, just eat a smaller portion rather than substituting healthier ingredients, especially when baking. If something burns slightly, throw barbecue sauce on it and call it smoked. If something that's supposed to be smooth comes out chunky, call it homestyle. A master chef told me this in culinary school. You can always stop cooking. Take it off the burner or out of the oven if you need to. Surprisingly helpful tip. Heat will remain in your food after turning off the stove and it will continue to cook. So pay attention to your timing. For example, when you want to add cheese to your omelette, cheese should melt in a plate with heat of the eggs. Otherwise you will have over-dried omelette. Same as overcooked pasta. Most recipes tell you to fry onions before browning meat. Don't. The onions will add liquid to the pan, meaning your meat boils rather than browns properly. If you own a decent pan you shouldn't even need to add oil. Add your meat to a dry pan. Don't overcrowd the pan. Batch fry if necessary. Another mistake is to not brown your meat enough. Listen out for the frying noise. Snap, crackle, pop, to die off. This is the MacLeod reaction, resulting in much more flavor. Edit. I'm talking about minced Ground meat here, not steaks. Cooking is an art, but baking is a science. Salt your food. It's amazing how much better things taste with just a little salt. Pour boiling water on a chopping board after cutting raw chicken. Will cook any remnants and make it easier to clean. Mise en place. Have all your stuff lined up and ready to go before you start. You don't want something to burn because you're busy looking for the tablespoon or opening a can of something. Also, read the recipe thoroughly first. Online ones especially. Many a time the instructions were unclear or the poster made a mistake. Not a chef, just Italian. Now, at last, I can rant on how to cook pasta. For the love of what's holy, wait for the water to reach boiling point before dumping the pasta in it. And remember to salt the water. Nobody likes eating starch glue. Furthermore, when making spaghetti, try to use a proper pot. It shouldn't be necessary to break the spaghetti in half in order to cook them. Clean it up as you use it. The longer you leave it, the longer it takes to clean it. Use a food scale, especially if you bake. A cup of something isn't always a cup. A food scale takes the guesswork out. Controlling your heat includes putting a thermometer in your oven. Not a chef, just a passionate home cook. Eater, I meant volume and not weight. A cup of milk will always be a cup of milk, depending on how you're filling the measuring cup. A cup of flour can vary a whole hell of a lot, but an exact cup of flour will always weigh the same. Not a chef, but I've done lots of home and commercial cooking and had enough criticism compliments that I feel confident enough to post. Take your time. The pan doesn't need to be at maximum heat. The sizzle doesn't mean it's ready to flip. It means it's cooking. If it can simmer another minute, let it. I understand time sensitive dishes and being in a hurry, but nearly every dish I've ever cared to try or throw together or anything benefits from time and care. On the note of throwing things together, never be afraid to experiment, especially at home. It's fun. And folks that don't cook and will mistake an experimental move for the better as a stroke of genius on your part. Wash your hands before starting. Let knives fall to the floor instead of catching them. Clean as you go. Taste as you cook. Vanilla extract comes out of the bottle really fast. I'm far from a chef, but a decent pan means everything. I was using old pans from Goodwill for the longest time and couldn't understand why everything stuck no matter how much olive oil I used. Got decent pans. Changed my life. Everything cooks more evenly. Just a home cook, but one thing I see frequently done wrong is crowding the pan. If you want to brown your meat, don't fill the pan to the brim. It will only boil in its own juices until it's still pale but also tough. Just put a few pieces in at once. You can place them on a plate once they're done and then do the next ones. I'm not a professional, but I humbly suggest learning about ratios and key ingredients. Rulemans 20 techniques, 100 recipes, a cook's manifesto and ratio, the simple codes behind the craft of everyday cooking, both by Michael Ruhlman and available on Amazon, are life-changing. Also, invest in Michael Bittman's How to Cook Everything. It's a primer for beginners and a really great source for experienced chefs cooks to break out of a rut. I often find that I have stuff laying around the kitchen that I need to use, and knowing about key ingredients, ratios, and having a trove of recipes that I trust to be good in their basic state to just pick through and advance makes eating at home a joyful experience for my partner and me. Edit: Michael Ruhlman, not Mark. MSG is half salt and half glutamate. It's very common to try to get glutamate umami into foods. Parmesan cheese, soy sauce, anchovies, Marmite, miso, tomato paste. They're all loaded with glutamate. They, of course, have their own places in cooking. MSG is just the super quick, easy, refined way to add it directly, in the same way that granular salt or sugar are the same for sodium, and chloride, and sucrose. There is no sin in MSG. All the hype is bullet. At the same time, do you want to reduce your sodium intake for health reasons? Use half as much MSG as you would salt as a seasoning. You've reduced your sodium intake by 3/4 while maintaining a very similar flavor profile. The sodium and glutamate both act to enhance flavors, but glutamate, a naturally occurring chemical in your body anyway, doesn't contribute to high blood pressure. When tasting something like soup or sauce, here's a guide to adding herbs and spices. Salt, you can taste instantly. After stirring it in, if it tastes bland, add more. It's not something that cooks off or in much in a soup or sauce. Black pepper, dry herbs, most other seasonings. After adding more, and don't taste until at least 15 minutes have passed. These ingredients infuse and release over time, and you can really overdo it. Beer, wine, alcohol. This varies a lot, and in some cases the alcohol should be added way before the other ingredients to simmer with some onions. Anyway, in cases like adding beer to chili, which I do often, again dump in about 6-8 Oz. Close the lid and let it infuse. Don't taste for 20 minutes. If it still tastes alcohol, why after this remove the lid and let it cook off more. Fresh herbs. Add late and as close to serving as possible. In the last 15 minutes of cooking. These are full of flavor and are generally best added near serving time for best flavor. Stop ducking with the food. Let it cook. Don't be afraid to experiment. Every successful new recipe or derivation was at one point an experiment. As a lifelong make up the recipe as I go chef. Always smell your herb spices before adding them to whatever it is you're cooking. It will help you determine what flavors will pair well. Seasoning is paramount. I didn't realize this until I got to know my GF's family. Most people way under-season their food or only use the basic salt, pepper, garlic powder etc. You think baked chicken is bland? You're not seasoning it enough. Olive oil, salt, pepper, rosemary, thyme, garlic powder, and smothered in paprika. Delicioso. Not a chef really by trade, but learned this while I worked as one. Take a small hand towel and either loop it through a belt loop or between your waist and your belt so it hangs over your leg as you move around. Then, you always have something to wipe your hands, your instruments on, and you don't need to go out of your way to do it. Season in small amounts and taste as you go. You can always add more, but once you've overdone it, you've overdone it. Also bonus, cooking is basically food chemistry and you can counteract different flavors and textures. You can add sweetness to counter bitterness, acid to counter sweetness, agents to thicken a dish and agents to thin a dish, etc. Make your own stock. Save the parts of veggies you didn't use, like ends of onions, inners of peppers, and chicken bones in a Ziploc in the freezer. Just make sure you don't put anything bitter like cabbage or broccoli in. Also never put lemon rind in. It will make it super bitter and inedible. Sweet things like carrots or squash are a must. Even pieces of apples are delicious. And I always make sure to put in some celery. Put it all straight from freezer bag to pot. Cover with water. Throw in a few bay leaves and salt and pepper and simmer for like 2 hours. I always try to have chicken stock on hand. So much better than store-bought broth. And you control the sodium. Your soups will never be the same. Also delicious to use to cook rice.